We aim to accomplish this by advancing an America First policy agenda, which focuses on things like ending the threat of woke and weaponized government, securing our borders, and also ultimately driving a more realist and restrained foreign policy, among other issues.
What does that mean, a realist and restrained foreign policy?
So when I say realist and restrained, in regards to realism, I mean that we accept the way the world as it is outside the United States, and that we have limited ability to change it, and that balances of power between nations are constantly changing. When we say restraint, we mean that we recognize that American power is limited, and we need to be judicious in the use of our power overseas, particularly military force. In regards to the use of military force, we believe that it should only be used when there are real threats to American safety and the conditions of our economic prosperity.
Do we have more limited ability to change it in 2023 than we used to in a post-World War II era in the 1980s? Do we just not have as much influence around the world, or has it always been limited?
There's always been limits on American power, regardless of how some people have talked about America in the past. But I think in this current moment, since the end of the Cold War, our power is more constrained than any other point in the last 30 years. We have a $32 trillion national debt. We have a real competitor in terms of China. We have record inflation at the moment. We also have a military that's been worn down by 20 plus years of endless war in the Middle East. We've also built our military to fight these brushfire wars instead of fight potential wars against near peer or peer adversaries like China. And so that limits our ability to do all the things around the world that many people in our foreign policy establishment, both on the left and right of that establishment, want us to do.
Didn't we have a real competitor in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s and had been fighting a Cold War around the world for decades and putting our military in places around the world, including in Vietnam, to fight these wars and try to influence the world? How is it different, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yes, so you're talking about two different eras there. In regards to the Cold War, we did actually have a real adversary. It was essentially a bipolar world. You had the Soviet sphere, and then you had the United States and its allies, what some people call the free world. And there was a true global communist bloc that needed to be checked. And it posed a real threat to the United States and our safety and the conditions of our economic prosperity. So that mandated a more forward and global posture that we needed to take. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States in the 1990s essentially became the world's dominant power. There was not a competitor. And I think that this caused a lot of people to think that there weren't actually limits on our power, and there was this hubris that led us to take foreign policy actions, particularly in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, that were really detrimental to United States security. It caused us to go into places like Iraq, to initiate nation building in Afghanistan, to undertake the Libya intervention, which has all those things have made us less safe. They've racked up our national debt. They've sadly cost us thousands of lives, and they've distracted us from more urgent national security priorities, particularly the rise of China. And all those things have put us in a situation where we have a global power position that, again, is constrained. And I think that what is important is that we need to recognize that, and we need to recognize that we can't do all these things that our foreign policy establishment and a lot of the leaders want us to do. And so that we need to prioritize what's important and deprioritize and stop doing things that aren't as critical to our national security and our prosperity.
So the two sides of this foreign policy view, a more forward global posture, a more limited America First posture. Who kind of represents those two sides of this debate in the Republican primary field right now?
So I think that the top three candidates right now, President Donald Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Governor Ron DeSantis, I think to varying degrees largely acknowledge that the United States exists within a world of limits, and that as a result, we need to prioritize what we're doing. I think the three of them would say that our top challenge is China, and that we need to do less in other parts of the world to focus on that. I would note that those three represent about, depending on the polls, 75 to 80% of the Republican primary electorate. Then you have other candidates in the primary. I would point to Nikki Haley and Chris Christie as two prominent examples that do not recognize that there are really limits on American power, and essentially describe a foreign policy vision where the United States is essentially serving as the world's global policeman, and that we can continue to do all these things that we did, you know, in the 1990s, or had the ability to do in the 1990s. And that includes, you know, continuing to support Ukraine indefinitely, deploying tens of thousands of more troops to Europe to shore up NATO's eastern flank, to potentially initiate another regime change war in the Middle East, this time in Iran, and then launch a new Cold War of China all at the same time. And those three, when you hear, or those individuals who do not recognize their limits, when you hear them talking, they do not recognize that we have real constraints that prevent us from doing all those things.
Is the Republican primary electorate voting on foreign policy? Is Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy leading because of the foreign policy issue? Is that the top issue in voters' minds?
You know, this is a good question. In most polls, foreign policy rarely rises as a top issue. It is an issue that is not high salience, so we say. But in a primary where you could have races that potentially come down to thousands of votes, or you have candidates agreeing on a large set of issues, foreign policy could be a differentiator. And I think that overall, for Republican candidates and policymakers running for re-election, the political advantage is to support a more realist and restrained foreign policy.